The Lake Erie Watershed Protection Alliance has one of those fun acronyms when you get to say it, LEWPA. And you're going to be hearing that one a bunch during today's episode of Between Two Great Lakes, and that's because I've got Joanna, a senior environmental compliance specialist for Erie County, and she's also a member of this group, LEWPA, and she's on today's show. Now, the Protection Alliance brought together Cattaraugus, Chautauqua, and Erie counties to help coordinate efforts in protecting New York's Lake Erie watershed. All these counties see water drain from towns within it into Lake Erie. So LEWPA was formed after flooding in August of 2009 with this idea of, hey, let's proactively manage our local watershed so we don't have these types of problems anymore. Joanna can explain it better, so let's get to it.
I'm Joanna Panazowitz. I am the coordinator for the Lake Erie Watershed Protection Alliance, also known as LEWPA. We are actually modeled after the Finger Lakes Lake Ontario Watershed Protection Alliance, known as FLOPA, so you may have heard of them.
Some good acronyms.
We love our acronyms. We sure do. There's also a SLURP.
A slurp?
In the St. Lawrence watershed, yes.
Sounds like a soft drink or something.
It does. So our mission is actually to promote collaboration and partnerships and protect our water quality as well as water quantity and address any issues around that in our watershed. So like I said, the focus of LEWPA is those partnerships and making connections in order to address climate resiliency and our coastal resiliency, as well as a host of other water quality. And when we say water quantity, we mean both high and low water levels. So I think that's part of resiliency that we don't get into very often.
Okay, so you're trying to address it or mitigate those issues from when the water levels rise or lower.
Yeah, Lake Erie is cyclical. Lately we've been dealing with the high water levels, but a decade ago everyone was really worried about low water levels and how that was impacting our shorelines. It's something that we need to make sure we're considering whenever we are looking at these coastal resiliency projects.
What's the cycle range, or is there just kind of unknown?
It's a bit unknown, especially with climate change, but typically maybe around every 10, 15 years it goes in those cycles.
So we're in a current cycle of increased water on the shorelines.
Yep.
And now you mentioned a big part of LEWPA is working with partner organizations. Do you want to talk about some of the groups you work with, what that entails?
So we're currently at Wright Park, and there's a project here that is funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And that's one of the partnerships that LEWPA has, the federal partnership. And the great thing about this project is that it not only has this federal funding component, but it also is working closely with our Soil and Water Conservation District in Chautauqua County. We have a good partnership with all of our county soil and water conservation districts in the LEWPA area. And we also work with state agencies, so New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC. There's a process whereby DEC can prioritize projects. LEWPA can bring those potential projects to the state. The state can then bring those projects to the federal government, and that's ultimately how we can access this particular source of funding. Part of what makes LEWPA pretty great is that we actually started in 2009 as a result of massive flooding along Cattaraugus Creek. And it was a municipal organization that got together. These were communities that were impacted by the flooding, and they formed the Watershed Action Consortium. They were dealing with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and that can be a bit of a hassle. And so they wanted to get together and think about ways they could prevent that sort of an issue from happening again. And as a result of that, LEWPA was born, so to speak. And so we wanted to keep that sort of local component. The three counties that are involved in LEWPA are Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and Erie counties. And we made sure that our board of directors had a local representative, so a municipal representative from each of those counties, as well as a regional government representative and a soil and water conservation district representative, because they're also on the ground working with these issues.
So that just keeping that partnerships, and it probably helped all together working like that, and somewhere to go, the resource, you can be that resource.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Like you said, we're at Wright Park today, down in Dunkirk. Can you describe what happened here? What was the project more?
So there were two main components to this project. One was creating a floodplain bench along Hyde Creek, which runs through the park. And so that goes along with absorbing the extra stormwater and also potentially filtering that stormwater. We have a beach here, a lovely beach that you can see, and so ultimately our goal is not only to retain stormwater, but treat that stormwater and hopefully address some of the bacteria concerns around our beaches. Near the actual Lake Erie shoreline, there is a constructed wetland, and so again, the goal of that is to help filter stormwater, and keep the beach clean and swimmable.
Are there some other projects you'd like to highlight that are ongoing or coming up on the coastal shoreline?
When you say coastal, do you include inland tributaries, or are you just looking at Lake Erie shoreline?
That's an interesting point. So you're dealing with both, I'm guessing.
We are, yeah. I mean, we look at the total watershed scale. So the entire Niagara River, Lake Erie watershed, which is portions of 8 counties in western New York. And like I said, LEWPA started along Cattaraugus Creek, so that's one of our major focus areas. And we consider that a pretty substantial tributary to Lake Erie. So the next project that's sort of on deck for LEWPA is going to be creating stream bank stabilization projects along 2 farms in the Cattaraugus watershed.
When are those coming up?
Those are just under development. The work plan is being scoped currently, so construction likely won't happen for at least a year on those.
I guess if you're looking at LEWPA, taking a broad perspective on coastal and climate resiliency, what is that broad perspective on that?
Like I said, we have a watershed focus, so thinking through things on that larger scale. And I think that land use is a really important part of that. One of the things we've noticed is that in addition to our shorelines being battered by wind and waves and seiche effects, there's also a runoff component. So depending on how you use that land along the shoreline, there can be some stormwater runoff that can weaken or erode those stream banks, which makes them more susceptible then to that wave erosion or that wind erosion that comes through. So, thinking about educating municipalities on how to properly handle land use, and also residents. If you have a shoreline property, maybe don't mow right to the edge. Consider having those buffers, having some native plants, some roots, some trees, things to stabilize that land, help absorb that stormwater, and help secure the sediment or the bluffs in order to prevent that erosion.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense what you're talking about. It's all connected in a way. It's not just the water coming in from Lake Erie, it's what's flowing out to it, because that will have an all-in impact. It's all going to work together or work against us in some fashion. So trying to work with that and manage it. Is the education side of it, how's that been going? Trying to talk to people and explain this resiliency side of things, like what you're trying to, or what LEWPA's trying to do.
Yeah. Well, again, the partnership idea. So we work closely with New York Sea Grant and all of the wonderful work that they do in trying to educate homeowners along the shoreline. They provide a lot of technical assistance. So working together with them on their outreach efforts, providing workshops. There's actually going to be 2 workshops coming up. So this workshop in July in Dunkirk is all about coastal erosion and learning about the processes and what to do to address that. And then in the fall, we're going to be focusing more on seiche preparedness for homeowners.
Okay. Are you finding there's anything new in how LEWPA's talking about it to people?
So LEWPA's relatively new. We've only been around for about a decade. But as I mentioned, when LEWPA started, there were very low water levels in Lake Erie. People were trying to figure out how to access the lake. Their docks were very high up. They couldn't get their boats in the harbors because there wasn't enough water. And so the problems were completely different just a little over a decade ago. So obviously the message changes as those lake levels change, and I think the idea remains the same, to plan for those cyclical water levels and to design projects that are able to adjust to those changing water levels. And that, as climate change continues, we're not entirely sure what that will bring. We imagine more water, but it's important to make sure that we are considering all the possibilities. And so resilience, to me, means thinking through all the ways things can change and designing projects that can adapt.
What would you say, community members, what could you say they could do more maybe to think about coastal resiliency? I know you were talking about mowing is one element, not going right up to the shoreline. There are other elements that just normal people can start doing to think of the coast and making it more resilient.
Folks who've lived along the coast for years understand that it's a changing, dynamic coastline. And I know the state has tried to push the idea of moving structures further away from coastlines. In a lot of cases, that's not possible because, lots are small. There just isn't space to do that. So protecting what we have is really critical. Homeowners can think about ways they can protect the shoreline that they have. I think there's a sort of history of walling things off. But when you do that, physics comes into play and how the waves hit those walls and can destroy those walls. They don't ultimately always protect the shoreline. And so it's important for us to start thinking through some alternative measures, especially if there is space to do that. So the more nature-based shoreline projects, they don't always work, to be quite honest, along what can be a violent Lake Erie. But trying out new things when there's space, when it's possible, especially in something like a park, that's really critical. And having homeowners think about how their property fits into that whole. When you just wall off a shoreline, you create a bathtub in Lake Erie, and the water's just going to slosh back and forth, and it can create additional wave impacts. It can affect nearby properties that maybe don't have that protection. And so we really want to get folks thinking about how what they do on their property impacts those around them and the whole community.
Right, because it is, going back to what you're saying, the whole watershed, this is all tied together. It's not just doing something here has no impact over here.
Exactly.
So kind of managing that, planning for it. What do you see as a hopeful outcome of this work?
I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. There's a lot of awareness around how things are changing, and I think folks are open to the idea of changing how we address that. There was sort of a standard way that things were done back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and that has sort of evolved now. And, we're thinking differently about how we stabilize shorelines and tributaries to the lake, and trying to incorporate more plantings, more nature-based solutions. And I think that the tide is shifting on that. There's a lot of folks who are interested in learning more, interested in experimenting a little bit with that, and the results have been really successful in a lot of areas. So here right in Wright Park, we're using that green infrastructure to address the stormwater runoff, treat the stormwater runoff, and help hopefully make the park and the shoreline more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Going back to my other thought, when you go to certain people, you can kind of say, oh, we actually have funding to do this. Mm-hmm. And so that helps get conversations going. So having that ability to say, oh, we can actually kind of cover this, and we can allocate these resources, that there's a problem and we can try and fix it.
Yeah.
So it seems like that probably helps as far as bridging any gaps that might be in the way.
Absolutely. I mean, one of those favorite phrases is unfunded mandates, right? And so when you can go to a municipality and say, it makes sense, we might need to make this culvert bigger in order to address increased water flow through a stream, the cost of that is pretty high. And that's not always something that a town or a village can absorb in their municipal budget. And so if we're able to say, hey, we can get grant funding to assist with that, they're going to be much more receptive to that. I think everyone has a love for Lake Erie. And like I mentioned, LEWPA really was municipal driven from the beginning. And so we think about municipalities as being those that we serve as well as stakeholders. And so always thinking about what are their needs, how can we meet those needs, and how can we partner to meet those needs.
Thanks for your time, Joanna. Best of luck with LEWPA. Everyone else, we will have additional shows on theme coastal resiliency. We're talking to some other partner organizations who have helped us with different projects, as well as people who have an insight on the Lake Erie shoreline. Also, thanks to our mission partners, Rich Family Foundation, M&T Bank, and Miller Construction for supporting our work throughout the year. To learn more about becoming a mission partner for Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, visit bnwaterkeeper.org/corporate partnerships. Thanks again for listening. Be well and do good.